I would now like to invite Capital First Executive Chairman, Mr. V. Vaidyanathan, to deliver the conclave's opening address.
Well, there's no one better to do the honors than Vaidya, as he's fondly called, because he truly reflects the rise with India spirit. After turning an entrepreneur in his 40s, he has been instrumental in funding the leaders of tomorrow, India's micro, small and medium enterprises. Vaidya, over to you.
Thank you.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Honorable Union Minister of Defense, Ms. Nirmala Sitharaman, Mr. Vineet Jain, distinguished guests, members of the press, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure to be here at the India Economic Conclave 2018. When we say rise with India at the India Economic Conclave 2018, we mean a growing India and also an India that is growing at every micro segment of this country. We say when GDP grows, large corporates of course will grow, but along with it, we'd like to see the growth of small corporates, kirana shops, entrepreneurs, micro-entrepreneurs, and so on. When we see the growth of large infrastructure companies, we'd like to see the growth of smaller feeder infrastructure companies. And therefore, when we see the rise of India, we want to see the rise of the small with the big. We all know that the Indian GDP has been compounding at a nominal rate of maybe upwards of 10% over the last 20 years. In 1990, our GDP was $316 billion. And today it has touched $2.3 trillion. Just 10 years ago in 2007, we talked of India's GDP crossing $1 trillion and we celebrated that. Now, what is the impact of GDP growth? I was surfing last night and I saw that someone has commented from Dubai on one of our blog sites saying that what is the GDP growth? Still people are poor in this country. I want to just leave some data points for you and more than that, some concept for you. I surfed and figured out the number of cars sold in India in 1990 per month. It was 10,000 cars. In 2000, it had touched 50,000 cars. In 2010, per month, India was selling 1 lakh cars. In 2018, India is selling 2.7 lakh cars. Now, for the casual observer, he might say, what is the big deal with cars as rich man product? So what if 2.7 lakh people purchase cars? But that's not true. When 2.7 lakh cars are being produced and sold in this country every month, it just means that so many more workers and employees got added in the factories of the Marutis and the Hyundais. There's also a number of dealerships that are getting opened. There's also a number of salespeople within the dealerships. Then the cars get scratched somewhere, and then someone is coming and repairing these cars. There's an ecosystem that is getting developed around each of these verticals, whether those products belong to the rich or they belong to the poor. And that sort of ecosystem is very important. And it is in this light that GDP is directly translating to growth at the micro level is what we get inspired when we see Morgan Stanley's report which says that India's GDP growth is going to be $5 trillion in 2025. Yesterday there was this conversation by Mr. Vivek Debroy saying that India's GDP will be $7 trillion by 2030. This chain of jobs that is expected to get created in the making of cars, two-wheelers, paints, soaps, houses, and the consequent multiplier effect on the economy and a so-called impact on the small entrepreneurs, small consumers is what is really going to bother us or going to benefit us as a large economy. But nothing happens by itself. In that context of the rise with India, we must definitely remember Newton's first law, which says, first law of motion, which states that for every object will remain at rest or in uniform motion in the same straight line unless compelled to change its state by the action of an external force. And in the context of the economy, that external force is reforms. It is because of lack of reforms that between 1947 to the 1990s, India was growing at a so-called Hindu rate of growth at about 2%, and therefore the poverty levels did not dramatically change. Now, in this context, there is one reason why we feel very bullish about India in the years to come. It is not just because of the fact that we are Indians and we feel patriotic and jingoistic and not such teenage, juvenile, supporting my team kind of India growth, and therefore India will do very well. It is because of certain structural things that have happened here. And what is the most important structural thing? The most important structural thing is no matter which government is in power since the 1990s, they have always advocated free markets, market-oriented reforms, and growth of the private sector. It's important. Governments have changed. The philosophy has not changed. And therefore, if you fast forward this theory over the next 20 or 30 years, of course, we are all in for a very good time. For example, the Aadhaar concept was seeded by the previous government, but this government carried it to a whole new level in terms of governance. Now, when we say reforms, we say DBT has saved the country anywhere between, say, about $15 billion, and now that is an annualized saving. When we say that oil subsidy has saved India $15 billion the last 5 years, these are annualized savings. So therefore, the set of, rather annuity savings, and therefore the set of reforms that are happening in India right now are annuity, and that gives us the confidence that this story is for real and will continue in the days to come. In this context, there is not a single public sector, except the Mahila Bank that got started about 4 or 5 years ago, which has also been merged with SBI. There's not a single public sector new institution that has got created in India in the last 25 years. There was a joke that I read somewhere which says that Jahan Raja Vyapari, Wahan Praja Bhikari. I think without saying it, I think the governments are really following it, and I think it's really important for the nation to know, and that is at the root of the fact that India will do well in the years to come. The other thing that when you see all successful countries in the world, whether it's UK, US, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, all per capita income between $40,000 to $60,000, all these people are predominantly private sector. There was the only time in 2008 when during global financial crisis when US government got involved and purchased stake in many of these institutions, but that also they sold within 8 or 10 years at a profit. And they're out of the business, out of running the businesses again in banking. So I think this is at the heart of the fact that we are moving more and more to a private sector and more efficient allocation of capital that will drive Indian economy forward. Of course, there are two significant issues with capitalism or free markets, and we have to recognize that in the course of the discussions today. Number one, crony capitalism, because crony capitalism is actually affecting resources, maybe grabbing resources, influencing the rules of the government in such a way that it favors the rich and so on and so forth. Number two is creation of monopolies, because I have pricing power, we are big, and so on and so forth, and people go and grab out the market share and then kill everybody in the process. Now, these are two significant issues, but the really good thing is that there are no such charges anywhere around the corner because of effective regulatory environment. And finally, of course, the last thing was that India had a very unique sort of capitalism where the large entrepreneurs could never die, and therefore they were continuously funded by banks again and again, but I think that problem is also resolved with the invocation of the IBC. Now, if the private sector is going to take such a substantial role in the growth of the nation in the next 20 years, then what is the government's role? And I think that's an important one to debate as well. One area is the government's role as a role of a policy maker, as a rule maker, as a market maker, as an ecosystem maker. And on this front, definitely over the last few years, a dramatic amount of work has happened. Number one, we take great inspiration from the fact that in an entrepreneurial sort of a way, this government moved very strong and firm on implementation of GST. There was a lot of lobbies which were actually working, saying that postponed for 6 months, system's not ready, and so on and so forth. God knows what would have happened if it had postponed for 6 more months. One new election around the corner, some new problems, new political problems, some logjam in the parliament, and we never know whether it would have got implemented at all or not. So in whatever form it was, got implemented, and I think given the fact that the checkposts, the borders between states have come off, and I think traffics are moving more freely, or the trucks are moving so much more freely and more productively, we just know that something fantastic is around the corner over the next year or two when GST stabilizes. That's a really good example of saying the government can get entrepreneurial and make things happen, and to align the federal and state taxes of 27, 28 states or 29 states with the center and make things happen, bring all the lawmakers together is not any less difficult than maybe aligning all 9 planets or 10 planets of the ecosystem, of the solar system. The second thing, more closer to our financial services business where I relate to, again, a number of reforms have taken place. I don't think that anybody in this room can deny that. For example, for maybe close to 30 or 40 years, there were maybe 26 private sector banks and maybe 26 public sector banks. But now suddenly 10 new private sector banks have come. 10 new in the last 5 years, that's a lot. And 5 new payment banks. Now that's a reform. Supply side has dramatically increased. Then number two, you also see that if you add what NBFCs have brought to the sector, the total credit outstanding in the last 5 years has grown from $575 billion in 2010, pardon me, to 1.4 trillion in 2018. And that's again an example of how the supply side ecosystem is definitely increasing. The third thing, again an example of a significant reform brought by the government, is about the digital India, because at the same time in the ecosystem, we not only have the Aadhaar, the Jan Dhan, the mobile, an ecosystem that is developed. At the same time, we also have the credit bureaus coming in. At the same time, we have artificial intelligence. At the same time, we have analytics. At the same time, we have big data. And you know, the RBI wants to go down the chain in the ecosystem for financing and opening accounts. The government wants to go down the chain in the ecosystem. Amazon wants to go down the chain in the ecosystem to finance and deliver maybe 200 rupee item to your home. So the whole ecosystem is moving tiny, and that item of going tiny was an opportunity not available before, was not the focus, or was not feasible because the ecosystem for enabling microtransactions did not exist until maybe 4 or 5 years ago. So therefore, by enabling digitization and by cutting the cost of transactions by a fraction as compared to before, definitely this growing India and the rise of India we're talking about today is not just for large corporates anymore. Even a small corporate can get credit today what they could not get before. For example, it's not unheard of for being able to finance a shopkeeper for buying a laptop today, or to buy a mobile phone today, or to buy a tiller, a cash counting machine today, the sorts of stuff that is impossible maybe even 10 years ago. So that clearly shows that the ecosystem is moving downwards to that more that, let me say, called a tiny economy. And that's very, very powerful and very empowering and very enriching and much more scalable than just financing the large corporates. Finally, when we talk of India, we are now no longer talking about demographic dividend. There is, people can talk about the digital dividend, and that digital dividend is for real. That digital dividend is not just in terms of market caps of startups and market cap of the Amazons and Walmarts. It is also the increasing ability of people like ourselves to finance those sectors, and also the small entrepreneurs to not just open accounts, but also to get credits. Now, finally, one important input from the government, which we have seen over a period of time, is to say that instead of it's empowerment over entitlement, and I think this government has said that quite a few times. We really like the term because it is market-oriented support to the poor. For example, when this budget happened, of course, there was no waiver for farmers' loans, but there was an increase of income to the farmer loan. These are completely two different approaches, because if you increase farmers' income by 1.5 times of the MSP, then they can honor the loan, rather than just writing down the loan. So this is a fundamental change of architecture, and I think, in other words, moving more and more to markets, even in intervention, through the example that we talked about, is a very significant change in the Indian ecosystem. When you put all these 5 pieces together about the reforms that are happening, being able to finance the small entrepreneurs, being able to finance the micro payments, and the government policy of being able to do intervention through empowerment and other through entitlement, this completes the picture of the reforms. Now, what holds up? What holds up? It's not that it's all done. We all know in the room that there are at least maybe 10 or 15 significant reforms waiting from labor, or waiting from maybe land, or a number of reforms that are yet to be done. And while the government has really achieved quite a lot, we all know there's a lot more to do. Now, there are a few questions that definitely come up, I think, which will need to get addressed today, or I guess during the conclave, is that how do political parties come together and at least make the essential reforms go through, no matter what are the other significant items you may be debating and fighting about in your quest for governance. Second thing is that when we say that small entrepreneurs versus big entrepreneurs, small economy versus large economy, how is it that we can create a differential or a supportive field to the to the ecosystem vis-a-vis the established players by providing them a differential tax structure, which the government has already done by saying that small entrepreneurs pay 25%, large corporates pay 30%. But I think the larger goal is, of course, to align everybody to 25%. But if everyone's tax rate comes to 25%, can the small entrepreneur still get a 20% tax rate because he has some way to go in terms of being able to meet the scale and size of the large entrepreneur, and therefore we can create some sort of a level playing field for people, for more entrepreneurs to get created in the ecosystem rather than power the big and the few. Now, it is nobody's case that that's what is being done, because clearly a lot of reform has happened, and you know, through Mudra schemes, a number of programs have reached the small entrepreneurs and so on and so forth. But clearly, we see the road ahead for India as very, very powerful, not because of the jingoistic patriotic feelings, but also because at a fundamental level, India has changed across political cycles, which we believe will power the growth of India in the years to come. When we say that, you know, we heard a quote just now, and we saw about the twist to destiny by our first Prime Minister. You know, he had written a book called The Discovery of India, but now we are discovering a new India which is empowered, which was never seen before, could not be served, could not be penetrated, but the new India, the new rising India is an inclusive India and is seeing growth at all edge of the pyramid through the magic of reforms and the magic of digitization. With that hope and wish, I wish all of you a very successful India Economic Conclave 2018. Thank you very much, Elizabeth.